Early morning sun filtered through the towering windows of the Washington, D.C. courthouse as Sarah Bennett adjusted her navy blazer and straightened her leather briefcase. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 2 decades of teaching constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center. Sarah hadn't planned to be in traffic court that Monday morning. Her research on racial disparities in the justice system usually kept her in libraries and behind computer screens, analyzing data and patterns. However, something about this latest wave of complaints regarding discriminatory traffic stops had pulled her out of her comfort zone into these hard wooden benches. The courthouse hummed along with morning activity. Security guards nodded at the passing familiar face. Clerks shuffled papers, and nervous defendants huddled with their lawyers, whispering. Sarah watched it all intently, her notebook open on her lap, her pen flying across the paper to capture the subtle interactions of how some smiled in greeting, while others she received curt nods, how certain defendants were cut short, while others were allowed to speak at length. She wasn't just any observer, though few in the room knew it. As one of Georgetown's most respected professors, Sarah had shaped the minds of countless legal professionals, including judges, who now presided in these very courts. Her articles on judicial bias had been required reading at law schools from coast to coast. Her expert testimony had swayed the outcome of more than a few landmark cases on racial discrimination. But today, nonetheless, she sat in the back, her nondescript attire of a blazer and pencil skirt rendering her indistinguishable from any other 9-to-5er who happened to receive a ticket. Her own citation and alleged parking violation on K Street was nestled in her briefcase. She had considered, for a moment, simply paying the fine online, but something about the circumstances, the poorly posted signage, the officer brushing her off, had turned her mind toward protesting it. The room slowly began filling with more people, young and old, professionally dressed and casual. Representing the full Sarah managed to observe that people unconsciously excluded other individuals and formed lines that were invisible yet clear. On all the faces of the subways, she saw the anxiety manifesting in defiance, resignation, and a few with confident ease of familiarity with the system. Sharp at 9:00 a.m., the voice of the BFF thundered, making one and all rise. Sarah rose with the others, straight yet relaxed, as she watched Judge Michael Harrison enter the courtroom, his black robes billowing out behind him. His reputation preceded him, especially strict on traffic violations, particularly in regard to minority defendants. What the young judge could not know was that amongst those he would pass judgment on today sat the very professor who had not only taught him constitutional law, but had also written one of his recommendations for with the appointment of Judd Il. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she watched him stride confidently to the bench. She remembered that as a student always the first to raise his hand, passionately idealistic about justice, yet at times blind to his own biases. As the proceedings got underway, and case after case was called, Sarah continued to make very sharp observations about each interaction, every decision, each subtle shift in tone. She knew full well that often the most dynamic lessons about justice came not from textbooks or lectures, but from real life that could force them to confront their prejudices. Little did anyone in that courtroom know, this ordinary Monday morning was about to get transformed into an extraordinary lesson in justice, humility, and the stubborn challenge of unconscious bias in the American legal system. Judge Michael Harrison sat in his chambers going over the day's docket. At 35, he was one of the youngest judges appointed to the D.C. Traffic Court, and he took immense pride in maintaining strict order in his courtroom. The morning sunlight cast his clerk could stack the day's cases in neat piles across the polished mahogany of his desk as he sipped his black coffee. Parking violations, speeding tickets, and other infractions, which most of his colleagues thought were too minor to be worth anyone's time. But Harrison pursued each case for an opportunity it was to stand up for the law, however small the violation was. His reputation preceded him down the hallways of the courthouse. Defense attorneys warned their clients about his non-nonsense approach, and even veteran lawyers straightened their ties a little tighter before entering his courtroom. Some whispered he was trying to prove himself because of his youth. Others believed he was building a record for higher judicial appointments. Today's docket looked typical: 27 cases, most of them traffic violations. Harrison scanned them, making mental notes. His eyes lingered for just a moment on a parking citation on K Street, noticing the name of the defense, Sarah Bennett. Something about that name tickled at his memory, but he passed over it. After handling thousands of cases, names often seemed vaguely familiar to him. He donned his black robes. Harrison thought of law school days at Georgetown, of those halls that had shaped and molded his sense of justice and the law. He remembered heated debates over constitutional rights, over fairness, over equality. But it was in traffic court that he had defined his own sense of justice: swift and unyielding. A knock at his door warned him that it was time. He stacked the papers neatly, squared his shoulders, and took one deep breath. In the mirror, he gave his reflection a last check. Young face set in serious lines, dark hair combed with military precision, robes immaculately settled the picture of judicial authority he had toiled so relentlessly to maintain. As he strode down the private hallway to his courtroom, Harrison reminded himself of the personal code: never lose control, never show bias, always adhere strictly to the law. These tenets had held him in good stead during his maiden year on the bench, admired, if not especially liked. For a flashing instant, his mind wandered back to that constitutional law professor of old, saying something about justice and equality once seemed so clear. Now, in the daily grind of traffic court, justice seemed simpler. Black and white, guilty or not guilty, pay the fine or face the consequences. The bias stood ready at the courtroom door. He heard the familiar shuffle of people rising on the other side. In a moment, he would take his seat at the bench, prepared to play the role of arbiter, doling out justice in whatever ways he saw fit. Little did he know, this Monday morning, like any other, was about to test his assumptions about equity and judgment. "All rise." Bay's voice boomed, and Judge Harrison entered his domain, his expression stern and confident, completely oblivious to the fact that among the faces turned toward him was one that would soon remind him of lessons he had summoned now forgotten along his path to the bench. The morning flowed along as Judge Harrison's usually did until case number 47 was called: Sarah Bennett, parking violation on K Street. The clerk called out, her voice reverberating off the crowded courtroom. Sarah rose gracefully from her seat, her movements deliberate and dignified. As she approached the podium, several attorneys present noticed something different about her demeanor. She carried herself not with the typical nervousness of a defendant, but with the confident bearing of someone intimately familiar with courtroom proceedings. Judge Harrison barely glanced up from his papers, his voice carrying the same stern tone he used all morning. "Miss Bennett, you're charged with parking in a restricted zone during rush hour. How do you play it?" Sarah's voice was clear and measured as she responded, "Not guilty, Your Honor." She began to explain about the obstructed signage and confusing rules of parking. But Harrison cut her off mid-sentence. Something had done quite a bit that morning to defendants. "Miss Bennett," he interrupted, his tone rising, decidedly impatient, "the officer's report clearly states you were parked in a clearly marked restricted zone between 4 o'clock and 6 p.m. Are you suggesting the officer was incorrect?" Several observers in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably at his tone. A few regular attorneys exchanged glances, noting how the judge's interruption seemed particularly abrupt. This time Sarah, however, remained unruffled. "Your Honor, if I may," she continued with practiced calm, "I have photographs showing that the sign in question was partially covered by overgrown branches, making it impossible to read the restriction times from the angle of approach." Judge Harrison's expression hardened. Had heard every excuse in the book, and this no different apparently from Miss Bennett's point of view. "The court is busy." Yet there is no such obstruction noted by the officer's report. As Sarah reached to retrieve the photographs from her briefcase, Harrison was circling his hand dismissively. That won't be necessary. The burden of knowing and following parking regulations falls on the driver, not the city. The exchange continued with Sarah remaining poised, while Judge Harrison became progressively stern, his responses shorter, his tone more clipped to the regular courthouse to onlookers. It was just one more example of the young judge throwing his weight around. What was so remarkable about this exchange is the unusual calm with which Sarah receives the obvious irritation of the judge. She stood tall, never breaking eye contact, to each dismissal replying with the practiced patience of a woman who had spent years teaching others about the very principles of justice being demonstrated in this moment. As the exchange continued, tension mounted, the air in the courtroom thick with unspoken emotion, even the bias shifting uncomfortably at his post. The other defendants, waiting their turn, watched with interest, sensing that something about this case was different from the routine traffic violations they'd witnessed all morning. Little did Judge Harrison know that his next decision would turn this seemingly routine traffic case into a moment that would challenge his whole conception of justice. Leaning forward in his chair, Judge Harrison had already made his decision before Sarah could make her final statement. Unbending shadows cast across his stern features by the fluorescent lights, he commenced his verdict. Miss Bennett, this court finds you guilty of violating City Parking Code 23.4, he proclaimed, the air of finality ringing in his voice. Given your obvious disregard for clearly posted rules, and given your efforts to argue with the officer's professional judgment, I'm going to set the fine at $500. Well beyond the normal $100 fine. A general murmur ran through the courtroom. The court officers accustomed to this setting looked equally astonished at one another. This was an extremely harsh fine for a simple parking ticket. A number of the other attorneys present squirmed, understanding the sentence was disproportionate to the crime. Sarah didn't move a muscle, standing quite still at the podium. She watched as Judge Harrison's quick jerky movements wrote out the fine on her citation. The young judge looked quite pleased with himself, quite certain had just made a statement on the respect due to the law. Moreover, Harrison went on, his voice considerably graver. I'd like to indicate for the record that this court takes a dim to regard those citizens who attempt to wiggle out of their obligation by questioning the competence of our law enforcement officers. The court clerk tipped, furiously documenting every word. The regular attorneys present who frequented this courtroom had never seen such a steep fine for a parking violation. Some began to take notes, as if this might become relevant in future cases. Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm and measured despite the circumstance. Your Honor, I accept the decision of the court. She paused, adjusting her glasses deliberately. However, I should point out that this will unfortunately require me to conclude my constitutional law lecture early this afternoon. Judge Harrison barely looked up from his paperwork, still writing his final notes on the case. Mississippi Bennett, your scheduling conflicts are not this court's concern. You should have considered your professional obligations before violating city parking ordinances. The courtroom was silent, unusually so. The tension could be cut with a knife. Even the bailiffs, we've seen hundreds of cases in this court, seemed to feel something big was about to happen. The morning sun had peeked outside and stretched through the courtroom in long rectangles, highlighting every dust particle that swam in the air. Sarah did not rush to gather her things. Each movement was intentional and calm. She did not seem angry or frustrated at the heavy penalty. Contrarily, there was a manner in which she stood calm, and with a quieted confidence that seemed to suggest this story was far from over. The next case was already being called, but several eyes still clung to Sarah. She made her way back to her seat as Judge Harrison had already moved on, oblivious to the fact that his next epiphany would shake the very foundations of his judicial confidence. Sarah's modulated voice echoed through the courtroom as she added one last comment. I do need to finish grading papers for tomorrow's advanced seminar at Georgetown Law. You remember those deadlines well, don't you, Judge Harrison, from when you were in my constitutional law class 10 years ago?" The courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Harrison's hand froze mid-submature, his face visibly pale. His head jerk was like a physical blow, surfeit with memories. Professor Bennett, standing at the front of the lecture hall, forcing students to deeply think about justice, fairness, and unconscious bias. Most of the attorneys in the gallery reacted with an audible gasp. The court clerk's fingers hovered, immobile over her keyboard. Even Baith, normally stoic, fought hard to keep his professional demeanor. Judge Harrison slowly looked up, really seeing Sarah Bennett for the first time that morning. She was standing there exactly as he had remembered her from his law school days. Commanding presence, inquiring look that had led him through most difficult constitutional precepts. It was ironic and devastating. It was Professor Bennett, who had written one of his strongest letters of recommendation for judicial appointment, who testified about his grasp of equal justice under the law, who had just seen how far he had strayed from those principles. Memories came rushing back. Impassioned speeches about judicial temperament, the warnings about the civil ways bias could creep into decision-making, the emphasis on treating each case with equal consideration regardless of the defendant's background. The young judge's face flushed red with embarrassment. The earlier SMUD evaporated as he realized he'd just provided a perfect case study and exactly the kind of biased judgment she had taught him to guard against. Sarah remained standing, her expression neither triumphant nor accusatory. She was still the teacher, and this had become an unexpected lesson not just for but to her former student, and to everyone else in that courtroom. That silence just hung there, and it hung there for what seemed like an eternity. The regulars who watched the proceedings of the court thereafter referred to it as the longest pause in traffic court they'd ever seen. The sun continued its morning journey across the courtroom floor, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage where an extraordinary drama was unfolding. Judge Harrison looked down at the exorbitant fine he had just assessed, and then back up again at his former professor. He was no longer the confident young judge, but again law student who had sat so avidly in her classroom learning about just those varied principles that he just failed to apply himself. Stunned silence was all Judge Harrison's courtroom could muster up at this instance. The weight of recognition leaned heavily on his shoulders, staring at his former mentor in Professor Bennett, who had shaped the early understanding of justice in his mind. 10 minutes, recess, he suddenly announced, voice quivering. He banged his gavel. Without a glance at anyone, he quickly retired to his chambers, his black robes billowing behind him. Once inside, Harrison collapsed into his leather chair, loosening his collar. His hands were shaking as he pulled out an old Georgetown Law yearbook from his bottom drawer. There she was, Professor Sarah Bennett, photographed during his graduating year, standing proudly with the constitutional law faculty. Memories deluged his mind. Her impassioned lectures about equal justice, her encouraging explanations during office hours, and, most painfully, her glowing letter of recommendation that had helped launch his judicial career. The very letter sat framed on his wall, its words now seemingly to mock him. In chambers, Harrison replayed the morning proceedings in his mind. He had interrupted her sooner than the other defendants. He had dismissed her evidence without consideration. He had levied a fine 5 times the norm, and he had done it all without ever once truly looking at her face. The baya knocked softly, signaling the recess was near its end. Harrison stood before his mirror, seeing himself through new eyes. The young judge, who had prided himself on being firm but fair, now appeared to be precisely what he was, a man who had clearly lost sight of the basic principles his professor had labored to instill. Outside his chambers, the courtroom hummed with hushed conversations. Lawyers who appeared regularly before him exchanged knowing glances. Each was privately musing how this revelation would change the young judge they had come to know. Sarah continued to sit, grading papers, as if this was just another day in her decades-long career of teaching justice. Future lawyers, her poise made that moment even more memorable. She hadn't come to argue but had let the moment be a teachable one. Harrison took a few deep breaths and squared his robes, steeling himself to go back into the courtroom. He knew the next few minutes would define, not just this case, but probably his judicial career. Judge Harrison returned to his courtroom, his demeanor markedly changed. The confident stride was replaced with a more measured walk, his expression now more thoughtful rather than stern. Professor Bennett's voice began with an unexpected humility. "I owe you, and this court, an apology. My conduct this morning failed to meet the very standards of justice you taught me a decade ago." He took a deep breath before continuing. "I've allowed my position to blind me to my own biases today. You've given all of us, a powerful reminder about the importance of fair and equal treatment under the law." The courtroom remained still as Harrison picked up Professor Bennett's citation and vacating the $500 fine. "Further, I am dismissing this case in its entirety based on the unclear signage you brought to the attention of the court." Sarah nodded graciously, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. "Professor Bennett, your lessons about constitutional rights and equal justice weren't mere classroom theory, they were principles I swore to uphold today. I failed to live up to those principles." He turned to address the entire courtroom. "Let this be a lesson for all of us, myself especially, that justice must be blind to prejudice, then not to reason. Our duty is to hear each case with fresh ears, and to see each person before us with clear eyes." The regular attorneys exchanged impressed glances. This was unheard of. A judge, aloud, admitting his prejudice, and then correcting his mistake. Several began to scribble notes, recognizing they were witnessing one of those moments that would go down in the history of the court. Sarah spoke finally, her tone unchanged from the hundreds of lectures she'd given. "Thank you, Judge Harrison. This moment shows why our legal system depends not just on rules, but on the humility and wisdom of those who interpret them." The transformation in the courtroom was palpable. What had started as a routine traffic court session had become a profound lesson in justice, humility, and the ongoing struggle against unconscious bias. The remaining defendants and attorneys watched as Harrison continued the day's proceedings with a noticeably different approach, more patient, more attentive, more balanced in his considerations. 3 months after the incident at Courtroom Georgetown Law, the central auditorium of the school was completely packed. Presiding Judge Michael Harrison was standing at the podium, with Professor Sarah Bennett beside him, speaking to a very attentive audience of law students and faculty. "What happened that day in traffic court," Harrison explained, "wasn't about just a parking ticket. It was about how easily our biases can cloud our judgment, even when we think we're being fair." The case had turned into a powerful teaching tool at Georgetown Law. Professor Bennett had integrated the case into her curriculum and made use of it to show how unconscious bias could seep into even the tiniest of cases. The story went national. Beyond Georgetown was quoted in law reviews and judicial workshops from coast to coast. Typical lawyers would comment on the noticeable change in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Every case was given due diligence. It did not matter how the defendant looked or where he came from. His reputation changed from toughest judge to being considered one of the most open-minded on the bench. He had transformed the exchange into a seminal research paper entitled Justice in the Mirror, looking at judicial prejudice in minor courts. The paper was already shaping the face of judicial training programs around the country. Sometimes, Professor Bennett spoke directly to the group. "The most relevant teachings about justice are born from life's unexpected moments. What is important is not the fact that we all err, but how we act upon the revelation of our biases." The event generated a wider discussion within the system of DC courts. Other judges began reviewing their own decision-making patterns that produced new guidelines for dealing with the traffic court cases. Statistical analysis across demographic groups reflected a significant decrease in disparate sentencing. Concluding the lecture, one of the students asked what Judge Harrison learned most from the experience. After a thoughtful pause, he smiled and said, "Justice isn't about knowing the law. It is about remaining humble enough to know our own prejudices and brave enough to correct them." The case came to be called the professor's lesson. It was a reminder among law students that true justice requires being in constant examination of oneself and being courageous enough to admit that one had failed to live up to the high ideal expected of him. The courtroom was reduced to stunned silence as Judge Harrison stared at the figure standing before him, Professor Bennett, the man who had taught him his earliest notions of justice. His hands clutched onto the wood as his knuckles turned white. 10-minute recess, he abruptly announced, as the gavel cracked through the silent chamber. Not meeting anyone's eyes, he quickly retired into his chamber, the black robes billowing after him, billowing behind him like a storm cloud. Once inside, Harrison slumped into his leather chair. His hands shaking, he pulled out an old Georgetown Law yearbook from his bottom drawer. There she was, Professor Sarah Bennett, photographed during his graduating year. Her eyes, both kind yet challenging, penetrated through time back to his own. Memories surged back, as from a burst dam. The passion in her lectures on equal justice under law, her patience during office hours as he struggled to grasp difficult constitutional concepts, and most painfully her glowing letter of recommendation which had helped launch his judicial career. The very letter set, framed on his wall, its words now seeming to mock his recent actions in the quiet of his chambers. Harrison replayed the morning's proceedings with growing horror. He had interrupted her. More quickly than other defendants, he had dismissed her evidence without consideration. He had imposed a fine 5 times the standard amount, and he had done it all without once truly looking at her face. The shame burned in his pectoral as he remembered how many times she had warned their class about the subway's prejudice could enter into decisions. Now he had become a perfect case study in everything she had taught them to guard against. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, whispers raced through the gallery. Attorneys who regularly appeared before Harrison exchanged knowing looks with others. The court officers, trying to sustain their composure, themselves couldn't help but shoot glances toward Professor Bennett with the respect she had commanded. Sarah didn't bat an eyelash but continued grading papers, as if this was just another teachable moment in her decades-long career. Her calmness made the situation even more poignant. She hadn't come to stir a fight, but instead had let the moment be one of those great lessons in justice and humility. The Bay knocked SL on Harrison's chamber door showed recess was all but over. The young judge stood in front of his mirror, but saw himself through new eyes. The stern disciplinarian, who had always prided himself on being firm but fair, now looking like he had been a man who lost sight of basic principles that his professor worked so hard to instill as he prepared for a return to the courtroom. Harrison knew the next few minutes would define not only this case, but possibly his entire judicial career. The weight of the moment weighed heavy on his shoulders as he squared his robes and garnered the courage to face the truth about himself and his actions. He reflected upon what Professor Bennett would expect from him now. Not explanations, not defensiveness, but with honest reflection and course correction. The lessons she had taught in years ago were about to face their greatest test, not in a classroom discussion, but in real-world application. The next knock at his chamber door was a bit more insistent. The recess was ending, and decisions had to be made. Judge Harrison took one final, deep breath in, squaring his shoulders. The time had finally come for him to prove if he could live up to those principles instilled by Professor Bennett into him all those years ago.